My parents texted me 6 words. Don't come. Only elites are invited. It felt like a public burial. But as they toasted their status, they had no idea the landmark mansion holding them up was standing only because my hands rebuilt it. Then, at 7:30, every phone in the ballroom lit up. The guests stopped complimenting the decor and started asking the one question my family couldn't answer. Where was I? My name is Harper Watson, and for the better part of my 34 years on this earth, I have been an afterthought. I was the placeholder in family photos, the guest invited out of obligation, the name whispered with a sigh rather than a smile, but nothing could have prepared me for the digital guillotine that dropped on a rainy Tuesday evening. I was standing in my kitchen, staring at the screen of my phone. The blue light was the only thing illuminating the room. The message was from my mother, Marianne. It was short, brutal, and devoid of any maternal warmth. Don't come. Only elites are invited. It was not a request. It was an eviction notice. They were not just uninviting me from their anniversary gala. They were erasing me. It felt like one cold text was enough to wipe my existence from their lives. Like I was nothing more than a stubborn stain on their pristine linen tablecloth that they had finally found the right chemical to remove. I tried to laugh it off. I tried to tap into that reservoir of cynicism I had built up over decades of slights and backhanded compliments. I told myself it was just another day in the Watson family circus. But this time, the finality hit differently. It settled in my chest like lead. All the past snubs, the forgotten birthdays, the seats at the children's table well into my 20s. They all felt like practice runs for this moment. This felt like a public burial. I set the phone down on the granite counter. The silence in my apartment was heavy, pressing in on my eardrums. I lived a quiet life, a deliberate life. I liked it that way. But knowing that across town, champagne corks were popping and a string quartet was warming up for a party where my absence was a requirement, it stung. It burned. Then, the phone buzzed again. It danced across the counter, vibrating with a manic energy that shattered the silence. The name on the screen read, Blair, my sister. My stomach did a slow, sickening flip. Blair never called unless she needed something, or unless she wanted to make sure I knew exactly what I was missing. She was the golden child, the one who married into old money, the one who never had a hair out of place. If Mom was the architect of my exclusion, Blair was usually the foreman making sure the walls stayed high. I slid my thumb across the screen to answer. Hello, Blair? Why didn't you tell us? Her voice was not the cool, composed drawl I was used to. It was high, thin, and laced with panic. It sounded like glass shattering. I frowned, leaning my hip against the counter. Tell you what, I'm kind of busy. Blair, I didn't want to interrupt your— Don't give me that, she snapped, cutting me off. Behind her voice, I could hear it. The heavy thrum of a bass line, the roar of a crowd, the distinct clatter of silverware on china. She was at the party. She was calling me from the center of the exclusion zone. You knew. You had to know. Why would you let us walk into this? Blair, I have literally no idea what you are talking about, I said, my confusion genuinely overtaking my hurt. Mom told me not to come, remember? Only elites. Stop it, she hissed. Everyone is looking at us. Harper, everyone. Dad is shaking. Grant looks like he wants to throw up. How could you? The line went dead before I could ask another question. I stared at the phone, the screen turning black as the call ended. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Blair was never rattled. Blair was Teflon. But she sounded terrified. I looked around my quiet apartment. My drafting table was in the corner, covered in sketches. My boots were by the door, still dusted with drywall powder. To them, I was just Harper. The disappointment, the one with the dirty hands, the one who didn't fit the picture. But here's the thing about pictures. You only see what is in the frame. You never see who built the frame. If you have ever been treated like a family secret, if you have ever been the person cropped out of the holiday card, go ahead and hit like and subscribe to this channel, but do it only if you want the ending. Do it only if you are ready to see the invisible become inevitable. Before we go any further, I want you to go to the comments section right now. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is in your city. I want to know who is here. I want to know that I am not speaking into the void anymore. Are you ready? Good. Because to understand why my sister sounded like she was drowning in the middle of a ballroom, I need to take you back 3 years. I need to take you back to when I was nobody. That party my parents were throwing? The one where they were clinking crystal glasses and laughing with senators and judges? It was happening inside a landmark mansion that my hands rebuilt. They thought they were standing in a venue. They didn't know they were standing inside my masterpiece. They didn't know that the floorboards beneath their expensive Italian shoes were only solid because I reinforced them. They didn't know the fresco on the ceiling was visible only because I spent 600 hours peeling away layers of rot. They thought they had erased me, but they were partying inside a building full of my fingerprints. I looked at the clock on my microwave. It was 7:15 in the evening. According to the schedule, a schedule I knew by heart because I had written the fire safety protocols for the venue myself, the speeches were about to start. My father would be clearing his throat. My mother would be tilting her head just so, catching the light. They were about to raise a toast to their own magnificence. But at exactly 7:30, the notification started. It wasn't a slow trickle. It was a wave. In my mind's eye, I could see it happen. I could see the light of 300 smartphone screens illuminating the darkened ballroom like fireflies. I could see the confusion rippling through the crowd. I could see the moment the conversation shifted. At 7:30, their guests stopped complimenting the décor. They stopped admiring the restoration. They stopped looking at my parents with envy. Instead, they all looked down at their phones, read the headline that had just broken across the national news, and then looked up with a single, unified question on their lips. Where is Harper Watson? To understand why I didn't scream when I got that text message, you have to understand where I came from. I grew up in Old Crestline, a suburb that functioned less like a community and more like a competitive sport. In Old Crestline, status was treated like oxygen. If you weren't inhaling the admiration of your neighbors, you were suffocating. The houses were sprawling, manicured estates where the lawns were measured in acres and the driveways were paved with crushed limestone imported from Europe. It was a place where happiness was not an emotion. It was a carefully curated aesthetic. My parents, Marianne and Douglas, were the undisputed champions of this game. To them, love was not a feeling you held in your chest. It was a currency you traded in the marketplace of high society. They measured affection in optics. A successful parenting week was not defined by a meaningful conversation or a shared laugh, but by how many influential people commented on our behavior at the country club. We were not a family. We were a brand. And my parents were the ruthless marketing managers. Then there was Blair. My sister was the prototype. She was the product that passed quality control with flying colors. From the time she was a toddler, she understood the assignment. She knew how to smile for the cameras, how to wear scratchy tulle dresses without complaining, and how to charm the donors at my father's charity auctions. She grew up to be exactly what they ordered, socially polished, married to a man whose last name was on half the hospital wings in the state, and perpetually presentable. Blair was the asset, and I was the complication. I was not loud or rebellious in the way that teenagers in movies are. I didn't dye my hair pink or run away with a drummer. My rebellion was far more offensive to Marianne and Douglas because it was boring. I was quiet. I was practical. I did not care about the gala season or the debutante balls. While Blair was learning how to host a dinner party for 20, I was in the library reading about structural engineering and Victorian joinery. I was drawn to things that were broken, things that other people threw away. I loved the smell of sawdust and the feeling of rough brick against my fingertips. I wanted to know how things were built, and more importantly, how to save them when they started to crumble. To my parents, this was not a passion, it was a defect. The distance between us was not a sudden chasm, it was a slow erosion, carved out by 1,000 tiny humiliations. I remember the specific texture of the silence that would fall over the dinner table when I talked about my day. If Blair mentioned a lunch with a senator's wife, my mother would lean in, her eyes sparkling. If I mentioned that I had learned how to reglaze a window sash from the 19th century, my father would check his watch. But the moment that truly defined my place in the family hierarchy happened 4 years ago. It was the annual Watson family holiday card. In our circle, the holiday card was a strategic document. It was sent to 2,000 people. A glossy declaration of our family's dominance. We were gathered in the solarium, dressed in coordinating shades of navy and silver. The photographer was a man my mother had flown in from New York. I was wearing a dress my mother had chosen, one that fit poorly and made me feel like an upholstered chair, as the photographer arranged for us. My mother kept making small adjustments. Blair, chin up. Douglas, hand on Marianne's shoulder. Harper, move a little to the left. I moved left. No, a little more back, my mother directed, her voice tight with stress. Behind Grant, we need to see Blair's necklace. I took a step back. Then another. By the time the shutter clicked, I was partially obscured by my brother-in-law's shoulder. I felt small, but I told myself it was just composition. It was just a photo. 2 weeks later, the card arrived in the mail. I looked at the heavy, cream-colored stock, the gold foil lettering. There was my father, looking regal. There was my mother, looking ageless. There was Blair and Grant, looking like royalty. And there was a potted fern. I blinked, staring at the image, where my shoulder should have been. There was nothing but the digitally extended leaves of a plant that sat in the corner of the room. They had not just pushed me to the back, they had edited me out completely. When I confronted my mother, she didn't even look up from her iPad. "Oh, Harper, don't be dramatic," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "The composition was off. You looked shadowy back there. It just looked cleaner this way. We put your name on the back, didn't we?" I checked. My name was there, in the smallest font available, listed like a footnote or a disclaimer. That was the day I realized I was not a member of the family. I was a prop that had ceased to be useful. The erasure moved from the visual to the professional. As I began my career in preservation, landing jobs with small firms and getting my hands dirty in the actual work of restoration, my parents struggled to explain me to their friends. To say your daughter is an architect is impressive. To say your daughter spends her days scraping lead paint off old window frames in abandoned buildings is, apparently, a social faux pas. I recall a cocktail party at the club. About 6 months after the card incident, a woman with a diamond the size of a grape grabbed my arm. "Marianne tells me you're working now. Dear, how wonderful. What are you doing?" My mother appeared out of nowhere, resting a hand on my forearm, her grip like a vice. "Harper is exploring her artistic side," she said with a bright, brittle laugh. "She's the one who does old houses. It's a lovely little hobby for her while she figures out her next steps." A hobby. I was working 60 hours a week. I was managing budgets of $50,000 for material costs alone. I was negotiating with city inspectors and structural engineers. "It is not a hobby," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I am a preservationist. I restore historic landmarks." My father laughed then, a booming sound that drew the room's attention. He clapped a hand on my back, heavy and patronizing. "She loves the old stuff," he announced to the group. "But Harper, sweetheart, when you have a real career, you will understand how the world works. We can't all live in the past." The group chuckled. They nodded. They agreed with Douglas Watson because everyone always agreed with Douglas Watson. I looked at my father. I looked at his manicured nails, hands that had never held a hammer, never felt the weight of a support beam, never built anything that could outlast a fiscal quarter, and I realized something profound. Arguing with him was useless. Trying to explain the value of history to a man who only cared about the future quarterly earnings was like trying to explain poetry to a stone. I stopped arguing that night. I didn't storm out. I didn't throw a drink. I simply smiled. a thin, tight smile that didn't reach my eyes, and I excused myself. From that moment on, I stopped updating them on my life. When they asked how work was, I said it was fine. When I got a promotion, I didn't tell them. When I was published in a trade journal, I didn't send them the link. I withdrew my need for their validation. It was a survival mechanism. If I didn't give them anything, they couldn't destroy it. They mistook my silence for submission. They thought that because I wasn't fighting for the spotlight, I had accepted my place in the shadows. They thought I was fading away, becoming the invisible daughter they had always treated me as. But they were wrong. I wasn't disappearing. I was building. I poured every ounce of my frustration, every bit of that agonizing desire to be seen, into my work. I learned the secrets of lime mortar and old-growth timber. I learned how to read a building like a biography. I learned that if you build the foundation strong enough, it doesn't matter if the people on the surface don't believe in it. It will stand anyway. I let them have their galas. I let them have their holiday cards. I let them have their pristine reputation in Old Crestline. I retreated into the dust and the noise of construction sites, where respect was earned by competence, not by bloodline. I was constructing a life that was solid, real, and entirely mine. And I knew, with the patience of a stonemason, that eventually, the things we build have a way of defining the skyline. It began with a phone call that would quietly change the trajectory of my entire life. I was working at Ashford and Vale Conservation Studio, a firm known for its academic rigor and almost religious devotion to historical accuracy. We were the people you called when you wanted to save a building, not just flip it. My boss handed me a file thick enough to stop a bullet. The label read, Waverly Hall. The Heritage Renewal Council had reached out to us in a panic. Waverly Hall was a 160-year-old mansion on the edge of the city, a crumbling limestone giant that had been sitting vacant for 2 decades. A commercial development group had just purchased it with plans to gut the interior and turn it into a high-volume luxury event venue. Their vision was what we in the industry call history as wallpaper. They wanted the exterior to look old and dignified, but they wanted the inside to be a hollowed-out shell filled with cheap modern finishes, drywall, and LED strip lighting. They wanted the aesthetic of the past without the burden of its weight. I took the file. I didn't just read it. I inhaled it. For the next 2 weeks, I ceased to be a person who ate meals or slept 8 hours a night. I became a ghost haunting the archives. I pulled the original blueprints from the 1860s. I studied the structural surveys from the 1920s when the East Wing was added. I memorized the fire codes until I could recite them in my sleep. I was looking for the story the building was trying to tell, the narrative that the developers were trying to silence with sledgehammers. My name was nowhere near the press releases. I preferred it that way. At Ashford and Vale, I was simply the lead preservationist on the account, a title that sounded dry but carried the weight of a judge's gavel. The developers were pushing for a fast timeline. They wanted to be open for the spring gala season. They proposed stripping the original lath and plaster to run cheaper electrical conduits and replacing the original hardwood floors with high-traffic laminate that looked like wood, but felt like plastic. I fought them on every inch, but the real war started when I looked at the ballroom. It was a magnificent space, designed to hold 300 dancers under a vaulted ceiling. The developers planned to increase the capacity to 500 to maximize rental revenue. Their engineers signed off on it, glancing at the thick support columns and assuming they were solid stone. But I had the original invoices from the builder. I knew something they didn't. I went to the site late one Tuesday night. The air inside smelled of damp rot and old dust. I climbed up the scaffolding into the ceiling cavity of the ballroom, a flashlight clamped between my teeth. I wasn't looking at the plaster. I was looking at the truss system. I scraped away 50 years of grime and found exactly what I feared. The main load-bearing beams had been compromised by a water leak in the 1970s that had been patched over cosmetically but never structurally repaired. The wood was spongy. It was rotting, deep and silent. If you put 500 people in that room and played music with a heavy bass beat, the rhythmic vibration combined with the live load would not just cause a crack, it would bring the entire roof down. The meeting the next morning was hostile. We sat in a glass-walled conference room. Me, my team, and the developers, who looked like they were late for a golf game. "You are being obstructionist," the lead developer said, tossing his pen onto the table. "Replacing those beams will cost us $400,000 and push the opening back by 3 months. Our engineer said it is fine." "Your engineers looked at the surface," I said, my voice steady, though my hands were trembling slightly under the table. "I looked at the core. The tensile strength of those beams is operating at 30% capacity. You are not building a venue. You are building a trap. If you proceed with this plan, you are liable for criminal negligence when, not if, that roof collapses." They tried to steamroll me. They talked about profit margins and investor expectations. They tried to make me feel small, just like my parents did. They treated my concern as hysteria. Then the door opened, and Dr. Elise Marlowe walked in. Elise was a legend in the preservation world. She was on the board of the Heritage Renewal Council, and she was my mentor. She didn't walk. She glided. She sat down next to me, looked at the developer, and said, "I have reviewed Harper's findings. If she says the beams are rotted, then the beams are rotted. You have 2 choices. You can fix it properly, or I will personally go to the zoning board and have your occupancy permit revoked before you even pour the first celebratory drink." The room went silent. The developer looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. He didn't see a quiet girl anymore. He saw the wall he was about to crash into. "Fix the beams," he muttered. We won. But the victory wasn't just about safety, it was about the soul of the building, with the structural integrity secured. I turned my obsession to the details. The crown jewel of the restoration was the grand entry doors. They were massive, 12-foot double doors made of solid black walnut, intricately carved with motifs of local flora. Over a century of varnish and weather had turned them into black, gummy slabs. The developers wanted to replace them with steel security doors clad in wood veneer. I refused. I spent 4 months on those doors alone. I worked on them in the studio, wearing a respirator, using dental picks to scrape away 10 layers of lacquer from the delicate petals of the carved roses. I sourced period-correct brass hinges from a foundry in England that still used molds from the 19th century. I treated the wood with linseed oil until it glowed like amber. I remember the day we rehung them. It took 6 men to lift them into place. As they swung shut with a heavy, satisfying thud, the sound of solidity, of permanence, I ran my hand over the wood. I could feel the grain. I could feel the history. It was more than just a renovation. When I was sanding down that wood, revealing the golden hues beneath the black rot, I felt like I was stripping away the layers of false narratives that had been placed on me. My parents saw me as broken, as something that didn't fit their aesthetic. But here, in the quiet precision of my work, I was capable. I was powerful. I didn't just restore a building, I restored the truth. I did it one joint, one hinge, one stubborn decision at a time. And as I stood there in the dust-smote light of the foyer, looking at the resurrected Waverly Hall, I knew that this place was now part of me. I had saved it, and in a way, it had saved me back. I had no idea then that the very doors I had just polished with my own hands would be the same doors my parents would try to lock me out of 3 years later. I had no idea that I was building the stage for my own public execution and my own resurrection. All I knew was that for the first time in my life, I had built something that could not be ignored. 3 weeks before the night that would end our family as we knew it, my phone vibrated on the drafting table. It was a notification from a group chat I hadn't seen active in over 2 years. The thread was titled, "Watson Family Core," a digital room I had been ghosted from long ago. My heart did a strange, stuttering kick against my ribs. For a split second, a naive, childlike part of me thought, maybe they want to include me. Maybe they want to bridge the gap. I unlocked the screen. The message was from my mother. "Regarding the upcoming 30th anniversary gala," she wrote, "we have been discussing the logistics, and we feel it would be best if you did not attend. We don't want to be in a position where we have to explain your situation to the guests. It's better for everyone if you stay home." I stared at the words, my situation. The vagueness was a weapon. It implied an instability, a messiness that didn't exist. My situation was that I worked for a living and didn't wear Chanel to the grocery store. But in Marianne's hands, the word suggested something clinical, something shameful. Before I could even type a response, not that I knew what to say, my phone rang. It was Blair. Of course it was. They moved in a pincer formation. Mom fired the shot, and Blair came in to dress the wound with poisoned bandages. "I saw the text," Blair said the moment I picked up. Her voice was breathy, pitched in that high, sweet register she reserved for talking to toddlers and waiters she was about to undertip. I tried to talk her out of it. "Harper, I really did, but you know how Mom gets about appearances." "Appearances?" I asked, my voice flat. "I'm your sister, Blair, not a stain on the carpet." "Oh, don't be like that," she sighed, a sound that managed to be both dismissive and patronizing. "It's going to be a very intense night. We have the state attorney general coming, 3 federal judges, and the entire board of the hospital. It's high society. Harper, it's not really your scene." The phrase hung in the air between us. Not really your scene. It was the polite way of saying you are not one of us. "I know how to use a fork." "Blair," I said, gripping the phone tighter. "It's not about that," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We just want to protect you. You know how you get overwhelmed. We don't want you to feel lesser than because you haven't strictly speaking achieved what the other guests have. It's a kindness, really. Kindness. Excluding me to save me from the shame of my own existence. It was masterfully cruel." "Where is it?" I asked. "Where is this event that is too good for me?" "Oh, we managed to book the most exclusive venue in the city," she said, pride leaking into her tone. "Waverly Hall, the grand ballroom. Apparently, they just finished a massive restoration. Mom says it's the only place that feels authentic enough for our legacy." I froze. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Waverly Hall. They were hosting their exclusion party in the very building I had spent the last 3 years sweating, bleeding, and fighting to save. They were going to dance on the floors I had leveled. They were going to walk through the doors I had stripped by hand, and they had absolutely no idea. "It's beautiful," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Well, we'll take pictures for you," Blair said, mistaking my shock for wistfulness. "I have to go. Harper, I have a fitting for my gown." The line went dead. 5 minutes later, my father called. If Blair was the velvet glove, Douglas was the iron fist. "Harper," he said, no greeting, no pleasantries. "I'm calling to ensure we are on the same page regarding the gala." Blair made it pretty clear. "Dad?" "Good," he said, his tone clipped, like he was closing a deal on a mid-range sedan. "The guest list is final. We have donors flying in from D.C. This night is about the Watson legacy. We need everything to be seamless. No distractions, no wild cards." "I'm a wild card now?" "You're unpredictable, Harper," he said coldly. "And frankly, we don't have the energy to manage you. Just send a card. That will be sufficient." He hung up. I sat there, stunned not by the rejection. I was used to that, but by the sheer audacity of the venue. It felt like a cosmic joke, but the real twist, the knife that actually drew blood, didn't come until an hour later. My phone buzzed with a text from Aunt Sarah, my mother's younger sister who lived in Florida. We rarely spoke, mostly just birthday texts and holiday emojis. "Hi, honey," the text read. "Just checking in. I heard about what you're going through. I know it's hard to get out of bed some days, but please know we are praying for your healing. Don't worry about missing the party. Your mental health comes first. Take your meds and rest. Love you." I stared at the screen, my mouth falling open. Meds? Getting out of bed? I worked 60-hour weeks. I managed construction crews. I had just saved a historic landmark from demolition. I was not bedridden. I was not on medication for a crisis. My fingers flew to the Facebook app. I didn't follow my mother, but her profile was public. She wanted the world to see her perfect life. I scrolled down to her post this morning. It was a photo of her and my father, looking stoic and elegant in black and white. The caption read, "Celebrating 30 years of resilience. Sadly, our circle will be a little smaller this year as we navigate some private family health struggles. A mother's job is to protect her children, even when they are lost. Please keep our Harper in your prayers as she seeks the help she needs. We are so strong together. Family first mental health awareness." I felt the blood drain from my face. She hadn't just uninvited me. She had pathologized me. She had publicly diagnosed me with a fictional breakdown to explain my absence. She had turned her cruelty into a performance of maternal martyrdom. I scrolled through the comments. There were hundreds of them. "You are such a saint. Marianne, it's so hard with troubled children." "Sending strength. Addiction is a beast. So brave of you to still host the gala while dealing with this tragedy. Poor Harper. Hope she finds her way." And there, next to every single comment, was a little thumbs-up icon. Marianne had liked them all. She was validating every rumor, every whisper, every lie. She was collecting social capital from my destruction. I put the phone down. I didn't cry. Tears were for people who were hurt. I wasn't hurt anymore. I was seeing the world with a terrifying, crystal-clear vision. For years, I thought I was just a disappointment. I thought I was the one who didn't measure up. But looking at those comments, realizing that my aunt thought I was mentally unstable, realizing that the entire elite society of our city thought I was a tragedy, they needed to pity. I understood the truth. They didn't just exclude me because I was embarrassed. They needed me to be broken. They needed a foil to make their own perfection shine brighter. If I was the troubled daughter, then Marianne got to be the strong mother. If I was the failure, Douglas got to be the benevolent patriarch dealing with a burden. They didn't just uninvite me. They wrote a story where I was the villain, and they were the heroes saving the family reputation. My hand drifted to the invitation file on my laptop, the one for the unveiling ceremony at Waverly Hall that I was supposed to lead. I looked at the date. It was the same night, at the same time. My parents thought they were protecting their image by locking me out. They didn't realize they had locked themselves in a cage of their own making. Inside a building that answered to me, I wasn't angry. Anger is hot and messy. I felt cold. It was the temperature of steel before you forge it. "Okay," I whispered to the empty room. "If you want a story, I'll give you a story." It was a day of violent contrasts. On the same afternoon that my mother texted me to confirm my erasure from the family narrative, the mail carrier dropped a heavy cream-colored envelope onto my hallway floor. It landed with a thud that felt substantial, authoritative. I picked it up, recognizing the return address immediately. It was from the National Council of Historic Preservation. My hands, usually steady enough to trace the hairline fracture in a load-bearing wall, were shaking as I tore open the seal. Inside was a formal notification. I had been shortlisted for the Vanguard Award, the single most prestigious honor for preservationists under 40 in the United States. It was the kind of recognition that didn't just make a career, it defined one. But the letter contained a second, more immediate detail. To coincide with the shortlist announcement, a major industry publication, The Modern Preservationist, had commissioned a long-form profile on my work. The article was already written. It was fact-checked, polished, and loaded into the content management system. It was titled, "The Architect of Shadows: How Harper Watson Saves What We Choose to Forget." I looked at the release time scheduled in the letter. 7:30 in the evening. Tonight, the irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. At the exact moment my parents would be clinking glasses to celebrate 30 years of a perfect facade. The national press would be publishing a 3,000-word deep dive into the daughter they were hiding. The article didn't mention my family drama. I had kept my interviews strictly professional, but it did mention my name. And it linked me, irrevocably and publicly, to my masterpiece, Waverly Hall. I needed to confirm the timing. I dialed Dr. Elise Marlowe. "Harper," she answered on the first ring, her voice crisp and warm. "I assume you got the letter? I've been sitting on this news for 2 weeks. It was agony not telling you." "I got it," I said, leaning back against my kitchen counter, the letter crinkling in my hand. "Elise, the article drops time. Is that hard-coded?" "Set in stone," she replied. 7:30 Eastern Time. Why? Are you nervous? "A little," I admitted. "It's just that the timing is complicated." "Well, it will be a perfect cherry on top of the evening," Elise said, the sound of a zipper in the background suggesting she was getting dressed. "I am actually just finishing up here. I want to get to Waverly Hall a bit early to beat the traffic. Your parents were kind enough to send an invite. I didn't realize the connection until the invitation arrived, but it's a wonderful opportunity to network with some of their donors for the council." My breath hitched in my throat. Elise was going. Of course she was. My parents collected influential people like stamps, and Elise was a titan in the nonprofit world. "Elise," I said, my voice tight. "I will see you there, obviously," she continued, breezing past my hesitation. "We can toast to the award in person. It will be quite a moment when they unveil the work." I closed my eyes. "Elise, I'm not going." The zipper sound stopped. The silence on the line was sudden and heavy. "Excuse me?" "I'm not going," I repeated, forcing the words out. "My parents told me not to come." "I don't understand," Elise said, her tone shifting from casual to sharp. "You are the lead architect. It is your project. To them, I am just a liability," I said, keeping my voice steady. "They don't know I led the restoration. Elise, they think I'm just a screw-up who dabbles in old houses. They uninvited me to protect their image." "They don't know?" Elise asked, the incredulity rising in her voice. "Harper, how is that possible?" "I keep my professional life separate. You know that." "No," Elise said, and I could hear her pacing now. "No, Harper, you don't understand. I don't just mean you should be there for moral reasons. I mean, did you not read the protocol for the venue opening?" "I wrote the fire safety protocol," I said. "I know the building. I am not talking about safety," Elise interrupted. "I am talking about the board's condition for the grant money. The Heritage Renewal Council mandated a permanent, physical acknowledgement of the restoration team. It is in the contract." My blood went cold. "What are you saying?" "There is a plaque." "Harper," Elise said, her voice grave. "A bronze plaque, 20 inches by 30 inches, mounted in the center of the foyer, right between those walnut doors you spent 4 months restoring. It lists the history of the house, the date of the restoration, and the name of the lead architect. It is covered by a velvet curtain right now. The schedule has your parents unveiling it at 8 o'clock. I gripped the phone. "They are going to unveil a plaque with my name on it?" "Yes," Elise said. "And if you aren't there, they are going to stand underneath your name, in front of 300 people, after having told everyone you were too mentally unstable to attend. Do you realize what that is going to look like?" It was a train wreck in slow motion. My parents were walking into a trap they had set for themselves. Blinded by their own arrogance, they assumed the restoration team was some faceless corporation. They never imagined their failure of a daughter was the one who had signed the blueprints. "There is something else," I said, my mind racing through the files I had memorized. "Elise, the occupancy permit. What about it?" "The temporary certificate of occupancy for the inaugural event," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "It's conditional. It requires the lead architect or a designated structural representative to be on site for the duration of the first event to monitor the new load-bearing capacity of the ballroom floor. It's a standard clause for historic conversions. I signed off on that provision myself," Elise confirmed slowly. "I am the lead architect," I said. "And I didn't designate a proxy because I assumed I would be well. I didn't think I'd be banned. If you aren't there, Elise said, her voice dropping, and the fire marshal does a spot check, or if there is even a minor issue. They get shut down, I finished. Immediate evacuation, fines, and the insurance is voided. I lowered the phone from my ear. I looked at the award letter on the counter. I looked at the clock. It was 6:15. My parents had constructed a night designed to celebrate their glory and hide my existence, but the building itself, the wood, the stone, the legal paperwork, was fighting back. They had invited the city's elite to a party that was legally required to include me. They were about to stand on a stage and pull a curtain off a bronze plate that would scream the truth they had spent years whispering away. I thought about staying home. I thought about letting it happen. It would be poetic justice to let them unveil that plaque and watch their faces crumble. But then I thought about the building, my building. I thought about the safety of 300 people dancing on a floor that needed monitoring. I thought about the professional reputation I had built from scratch. If the event was shut down because the architect was a no-show, it wouldn't just hurt my parents. It would hurt me. It would look like I had abandoned my post. My parents had told me I was a liability. They had told the world I was broken. But the truth was sitting in the fine print of a municipal contract. Were they about to need me in the same room they told me not to enter? I was not physically present when the doors to Waverly Hall swung open at 6 o'clock in the evening. But I know the script of a Watson gala better than I know my own heartbeat. I know exactly how the air smelled. Expensive perfume, starch, and the metallic tang of chilled champagne. I know that the lighting was dimmed to a precise amber hue, designed to smooth out wrinkles and make jewelry sparkle with predatory intensity. It was a masterclass in curated glamour, a stage set where status was on display and admission was judged by the weight of your donation. Marianne was in her element. She would have been standing near the entrance, but not too near, forcing people to come to her. She was playing the role of the queen host, a benevolent matriarch, celebrating 3 decades of marriage and philanthropy. She wore a gown that cost more than my first car, smiling that practiced, tight smile that never quite reached her eyes, but looked fantastic in flash photography. Douglas was working the room like a salesman closing the biggest deal of his life. He moved from donor to judge to senator, his handshakes firm, his laugh booming, collecting prestige like poker chips. The guests, however, were not just looking at my parents. They were looking at the room. Waverly Hall was showing off. The amber light caught the rich, honeyed tones of the restored walnut paneling. It danced off the brass fixtures I had sourced from that foundry in England. The ceiling, with its recovered fresco, soared above them, a testament to months of neck-straining labor. "The architecture is simply stunning, Marianne," a senator's wife reportedly said, running a gloved hand along a column I had reinforced with carbon fiber. "Who did the restoration? The attention to detail is exquisite." My mother gave a dismissive little shrug, a gesture I had seen 1,000 times. "Oh, you know how these things are," she said, waving her champagne flute vaguely. "We hired a firm to handle the logistics. The event coordinator took care of the aesthetics. We just wanted a venue that felt timeless." She reduced 3 years of forensic architecture to aesthetics. She reduced my blood and sweat to a party decoration. She accepted the compliment for the building in the same breath that she erased the builder. Then, the atmosphere shifted slightly. The air near the entrance grew cooler, sharper. Doctor Elise Marlowe had arrived. Elise did not blend in. She commanded attention without trying. She wore a structured suit that looked more like armor than evening wear, and she moved through the crowd with the efficiency of a predator. She wasn't drinking champagne. She was studying the room. She looked at the joinery on the window casings. She looked at the load-bearing columns. She was checking my work, not as a critic, but as a general inspecting the battlefield. She cut a path straight to my mother. "Marianne," Elise said, her voice cutting through the ambient chatter. "Elise, I am so glad you could make it," my mother exclaimed, leaning in for an air kiss that Elise expertly dodged. "We are hoping to get the Heritage Council involved in Douglas's new initiative." "The restoration is remarkable," Elise said, ignoring the pitch. She looked my mother dead in the eye. "Is Harper here yet?" I wanted to introduce her to the chairman of the zoning board. My mother's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. She adjusted her diamond bracelet. A nervous tick. "Oh, poor Harper. She couldn't make it. I'm afraid. She is well. She is not well. We thought it best she stayed home and rested. The crowds can be so triggering for her right now." It was the lie she had rehearsed. It was the sympathy narrative in action. Elise did not blink. She held my mother's gaze for a beat too long, creating a silence that was thick with tension. "That is odd," Elise said, her voice perfectly level, loud enough for the circle of donors nearby to hear. "I spoke with her yesterday regarding the final occupancy permit. She sounded perfectly fine. In fact, she sounded sharper than I have heard her in years." My mother's laugh was brittle, like dry leaves stepping on pavement. "Well, you know how volatile these things can be. One day up, one day down. We are just trying to be supportive." Elise didn't respond. She just took a sip of water and checked her watch. It was 7:29 in the evening. The band was playing a soft jazz standard. The room was a sea of black ties and sequins. My parents were standing in the center of the ballroom, under the great crystal chandelier I had rewired, feeling invincible. Then, the clock ticked over. It was 7:30. It started with a single chime, a text message notification from a phone in a pocket, then another, then a buzz from a clutch purse, then 3 more. Within 30 seconds, the room was filled with a discordant symphony of pings, vibrations, and ringtones. It was as if an invisible wave had washed over the crowd. People stopped talking. They reached into pockets and purses, their faces illuminated by the pale blue glow of screens. The jazz band played on for a moment, unaware that they had lost their audience. Before trailing off into confused silence, a reporter from the City Chronicle, a man my father had invited specifically to cover the glamour of the evening, was the first to gasp. He was staring at his phone, his thumb scrolling rapidly. The headline from the Modern Preservationist had dropped. It was being shared by the architectural blogs, the local news aggregators, and the preservation networks. The Architect of Shadows, Harper Watson, and the Resurrection of Waverly Hall. The feature image was a black and white portrait of me, standing on the scaffolding of this very room, wearing work boots and a hard hat, looking directly into the camera with a gaze that was nothing like the troubled, fragile girl my parents had invented. I looked strong. I looked competent. I looked like the person who owned the room. The reporter looked up from his phone. He looked at Douglas, then he looked at Marianne, then he looked back at the screen. "Watson?" he whispered to the woman next to him. "Wait, Harper Watson? Isn't that their daughter?" The whisper spread like a contagion. It moved from the reporters to the donors, from the donors to the judges. "Lead architect?" someone muttered. "She restored this? The whole building?" I thought Marianne said she was unstable. I thought they said an event coordinator handled it. My mother, sensing the shift, tried to regain control. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice pitching up. "Why is everyone on their phones? Douglas, make a toast." But Douglas was frozen. He was watching a federal judge, a man he needed for his next business venture, turn his phone screen toward him. "Douglas," the judge said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "This article, it says your daughter, Harper, is the lead preservationist for this project. It says she saved the building from collapse." My mother froze. Her eyes darted around the room. She saw the screens, dozens of them, hundreds of them, and on every single one of them was my face. She wasn't looking at a party anymore. She was looking at a jury. The carefully constructed reality of the elite-only gala was dissolving. The story of the broken daughter was colliding head-on with the reality of the celebrated architect, and the impact was shattering the evening into 1,000 jagged pieces. And I wasn't even in the building yet. The ballroom didn't explode. It curdled. The shift in the atmosphere was not loud. It was a sudden, suffocating drop in pressure, The ambient noise of 300 people mingling, the clinking of crystal, the polite laughter, it all evaporated, replaced by a low, static hum of whispers that felt far more dangerous than shouting. I watched the scene unfold through the descriptions of others later. But I know the players well enough to see it in high definition. My father, Douglas, was the first to feel the wall close in. He had been in the middle of a conversation with Marcus Sterling, one of the city's most aggressive real estate developers and a man whose checkbook determined the success of the charity season. Sterling was not a man who enjoyed being played. Sterling held his phone up, the screen glowing with the article that detailed my forensic restoration of the very floor they were standing on. He stepped into my father's personal space. "Douglas," Sterling said, his voice carrying a jagged edge, "this article says your daughter, the one you didn't mention tonight, is the lead architect on this project. It says she is the reason this building is standing." Douglas blinked. It was his only tell. He immediately deployed his boardroom face. I grew up watching this expression. It was a mask of blank, terrifying neutrality, designed to refuse any emotional accountability. It was the face he used when firing employees or denying liability in a lawsuit. "Harper has had a hand in some projects," Douglas said, his voice flat, devoid of pride or shame. "We try not to mix family business with these events. The focus tonight is on the foundation." "The focus is on the building," Sterling corrected, tapping the phone screen. "You told me 10 minutes ago that you didn't know who handled the restoration. You said it was some firm. Are you telling me you don't know your own daughter's employer? Or were you lying to me?" For a man like Douglas, being called a liar was manageable. Being called incompetent, being accused of not knowing the details of his own event, was fatal. "It is a complex situation," Douglas said, reaching for his scotch. "Harper is difficult. We manage her involvement carefully," while Douglas tried to stonewall a billionaire. Blair was undergoing a more public dismantling. She was standing near the Champagne Tower, surrounded by the Junior League socialites she usually ruled over. She had spent the first hour of the party sighing dramatically about my struggles and lost path. But now, those same women were scrolling through a 3,000-word article that described me not as lost, but as a visionary. "Blair," one of the women said, looking up from her screen with wide eyes. "This says Harper spent 4 months restoring these doors by hand. It says she won a National Vanguard Award. I thought you said she was, mentally fragile?" Blair's smile twitched. It was a glitch in her programming. "Well, high-functioning people can still be unwell. Jessica, we just want what is best for her." "She doesn't sound unwell," another woman said, reading from the screen. "She sounds brilliant." Then, a voice cut through the murmuring like a knife. It was a young woman near the stage, perhaps an intern or a junior reporter, who had been reading the article silently and felt compelled to speak the words into existence. "Listen to this," she said, and the room fell silent to hear her. She read a quote from my interview, my voice filling the room without me being there. "I learned early on that if you don't fit the picture, they will crop you out. So I stopped trying to be in the picture. I started focusing on the frame. When people wouldn't listen, I built something they couldn't ignore." The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't the silence of politeness. It was the silence of people realizing they had been complicit in a lie. The story my parents had sold, of the tragic, incapable daughter, was dissolving, revealing the ugly machinery of their manipulation underneath. That was the moment Elise Marlowe chose to step forward. She didn't take the microphone. She didn't need to. She simply walked to the center of the room, her heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor I had saved. She stood next to Marianne, who looked like she was trying to calculate an exit strategy that didn't involve running. "If I may," Elise said, her voice projecting with the authority of a woman who had stared down city councils and bulldozers. "As the representative of the Heritage Renewal Council, I want to clarify something regarding the venue you are all enjoying." She gestured to the ceiling, to the heavy timber beams hidden behind the plaster. 3 years ago, this building was a death trap, Elise stated calmly. The previous developers wanted to cover up dry rot in the main truss system. They wanted to prioritize aesthetics over safety to get this venue open for the gala season. It would have saved money. It would have been faster. She paused, letting the implications sink in. The guests looked up at the ceiling, suddenly aware of the tons of material hanging over their heads. The only reason that roof is not collapsing on us right now, Elise continued, is because the lead architect refused to sign off on the shortcuts. She risked her job. She fought a legal battle for 6 months to ensure that the steel reinforcements were installed. She prioritized your lives over the timeline. Elise turned to look at Marianne. Harper Watson is not unwell. Marianne, she is the most principled preservationist I have ever worked with. And she is the only reason you are able to host this party without a criminal negligence lawsuit. The lie about my mental health didn't just break, it shattered into shrapnel. The guests looked at Marianne. They didn't see a strong mother dealing with a troubled child anymore. They saw a woman who had smeared her daughter's reputation to cover up her own jealousy. They realized that while they were sipping champagne, my parents had been actively trying to bury the person who kept them safe. Marianne opened her mouth to speak, to spin, to charm. But the room had turned. Marcus Sterling, the donor who had cornered Douglas, set his glass down on a passing waiter's tray. The sound was sharp. Douglas, Sterling said, loud enough for the immediate circle to hear, I think we are going to pause our discussions regarding the hospital board charity. I have strict criteria for my partners. Marcus, let's not be rash, Douglas started, his composure cracking. It is not rash, Sterling said, buttoning his jacket. It is about integrity. A man who tries to erase the person who built his foundation is not a man I trust with my money. He turned and walked away. It was a signal. The social tide receded instantly. Near the champagne tower, the collapse was more personal. Grant, my brother-in-law, was staring at Blair. Grant was a man who cared about 2 things: his stock portfolio and his public image. He had bought into the Harper is crazy narrative because it was easy. Now, he looked at his wife like she was a stranger. You told me she was in therapy, Grant said quietly. You told me she was unemployed and living off Dad's handouts. She was struggling. Grant, Blair whispered furiously, grabbing his arm. You don't know the whole story. I am reading the whole story right now, Grant said, holding up his phone. She is a Vanguard Award nominee. She is a hero, and you made me treat her like a pariah. He pulled his arm away from her grip. What else have you lied about, Blair? Blair stood there, her mouth opening and closing, breathless. For the first time in her life, the perfect script had run out of pages. There were no lines left to say. The party was still happening. The music was still playing. The lights were still dim, but the gala was over. The guests were no longer celebrating the Watsons. They were waiting. They were checking the doors, watching the entrance, wondering if the ghost in the machine was going to show herself. They didn't have to wait long. I sat on the edge of my sofa, the phone resting on my knee like a live wire. The screen was a constant cascade of notifications, missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, texts from cousins who hadn't spoken to me in a decade, and voicemails from Blair that I didn't have the stomach to listen to. I could feel the chaos unfolding across town. I could feel the heat of the fire my parents had started, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of getting burned. I realized that as long as I stayed in this apartment, hiding in the dark, I was letting them narrate the ending. I was letting them tell the world that I was cowering in shame, playing the role of the tragic, invisible daughter. I stood up. The decision wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It was the click of a lock falling into place. I was done being a ghost. I went to my closet. In the movies, this is the part where the heroine puts on a red dress, slashes on bright lipstick, and storms the castle to burn it down. But I didn't want to burn Waverly Hall. I wanted to honor it. I chose a black jumpsuit, tailored and sharp, with a high neckline and wide legs that moved with a fluid, architectural grace. I didn't put on war paint. I pulled my hair back into a low, severe knot. I wanted my face to be visible. I wanted nothing to hide the clarity in my eyes. I looked in the mirror, and I didn't see a victim. I saw the lead architect. I took the long way to the venue. I drove down the winding back roads that hug the river, keeping the windows down despite the chill in the night air. I needed to breathe. I needed to feel the cold against my skin to remind myself that I was real, that I was solid. I drove at exactly the speed limit, listening to the hum of the tires on the asphalt. With every mile, the anxiety that had defined my life for 34 years began to recede, replaced by a strange, cold calm. I wasn't going there to fight. Fighting implies you are trying to change someone's mind. I was going there to stand. When I pulled up the long, gravel driveway of Waverly Hall, the valet looked confused. He was used to limousines and luxury sedans, not my practical SUV with the faint dust of a construction site still on the floor mats. I handed him the keys and walked toward the entrance. The building rose up before me, illuminated by the amber uplights I had personally positioned 3 months ago. It looked magnificent. It looked alive. I stopped at the grand entry doors, the 12-foot walnut slabs that had taken 4 months of my life to restore. I didn't just walk through them. I reached out and placed my palm flat against the wood. I felt the grain, the smoothness of the oil finish, the sturdiness of the brass hinges. It was a grounding wire. This wood knew my hands. This stone knew my weight. I wasn't a guest crashing a party. I was the reason the party had a roof over its head. I pushed the doors open. The transition was instant. I moved from the cool silence of the night into the warm, heavy atmosphere of the ballroom. The air was thick with tension. The band had stopped playing. Or maybe they were playing so softly it didn't register. There was a low hum of conversation, the sound of hundreds of people trying to whisper at once. I took 3 steps into the foyer and stopped. It started at the periphery. A waiter dropped a napkin. A woman near the coat check turned, her eyes widening. Then, a man in a tuxedo nudged his wife. The ripple moved through the room faster than sound. Heads turned, shoulders shifted. The crowd, which had been a solid wall of black tie and expensive fabric, began to part. It wasn't a polite parting. It was a recoil, a mixture of shock and curiosity. "That is her," I heard a woman whisper, her voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "That is Harper Watson. She looks formidable." I didn't look at the floor. I didn't look at the guests. I looked straight ahead, locking my eyes on the 2 people standing at the center of the room like statues caught in a landslide. Marianne and Douglas were frozen. My mother was clutching her champagne glass so hard, her knuckles were white. My father looked as if he had been struck by lightning. They were staring at me not with love or even anger, but with pure, unadulterated fear. They were looking at a ghost who had decided to walk back into the living room. I walked toward them. I didn't rush. I moved with the steady, measured pace of someone inspecting a job site. The sound of my heels on the hardwood floor, my floor, was a steady metronome counting down the seconds of their control. The crowd watched. I could feel their eyes on me, reassessing, recalculating. They were looking for the troubled girl. They were looking for the mess. Instead, they saw a woman walking in a straight line, unhurried and unafraid. I stopped 5 feet away from my parents. The space between us felt like a canyon. "I got your message," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the acoustic perfection of the hall I had designed, it carried to the back of the room. "I know I wasn't invited." Marianne blinked, her social training kicking in like a reflex. She took a half step forward, her face twisting into a mask of tragic concern. She reached out a hand, trembling slightly, as if to pet a frightened animal. "Harper," she said, her voice dripping with that sickening, syrupy sweetness she used when she wanted to manipulate an audience. "Sweetheart, we didn't want you to come because, well, we thought you would be overwhelmed. We were just trying to protect you." The room held its breath. It was the perfect line. It was the safety hatch. She was offering me a way out, a way to accept the role of the fragile daughter who needed protecting, and in doing so, save her own face. I looked at her hand, then I looked at her eyes. You didn't think I would be overwhelmed, I said, my voice cutting through the syrup like a razor. You told people I was broken. The gasp from the crowd was audible. Marianne flinched as if I had slapped her. There is a difference, I continued, my voice steady, rising just enough to reach the donors standing behind her. You didn't exclude me because you were worried about my health. You excluded me because you were worried about your narrative. You needed a tragedy to make yourselves look like saints. Harper, this is not the place, Douglas hissed. Stepping forward, his face a mask of furious embarrassment. We are in the middle of a celebration. I know, I said, meeting his gaze without blinking. I am not here to ruin your party. Dad, I am not here to make a scene or throw wine. I gestured to the room around us, to the soaring ceiling and the solid walls. I am here because the occupancy permit for this building requires the lead architect to be present, I said. I am here because I signed my name for the safety of every person in this room. I am here because the building matters. I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment settle on their shoulders. And, I added, my voice dropping to a register of absolute finality, I am here because the truth matters, and I am done letting you edit it out. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute, but it was not empty. It was filled with the frantic, invisible energy of a narrative collapsing in real time. My parents were standing there, stripped of their armor, but the universe had one final domino left to push over. A man in a tuxedo stepped into the circle. It was Arthur Penhaligon, the chairman of the venue's board of directors. He was an older man, oblivious to the family psychodrama playing out, or perhaps he simply did not care. He was holding a small remote control in his hand, and he looked relieved to see me. Ms. Watson, he boomed, his voice jovial and loud. Perfect timing. We were just about to proceed with the unveiling. Since you are here, you should do the honors. Before my mother could move, before Douglas could signal a security guard, Arthur pressed the button on his remote. Behind my parents, the velvet curtains that had been covering the central pillar of the foyer, motor drew back with a soft whir. The bronze plaque was revealed. It was massive, polished to a mirror finish, and illuminated by a dedicated spotlight. The text was clear, etched deep into the metal. It detailed the history of Waverly Hall, the year of its near destruction, and the year of its salvation, and there, centered at the bottom in the largest font on the display, were the words, Lead Architect of Restoration, Harper Watson. The cameras flashed. It was a blinding strobe effect. Every society photographer and half the guests with smartphones captured the image. They captured my name carved in bronze, hovering literally over my mother's left shoulder. Marianne froze. I watched the color drain from her face, leaving her looking gray and brittle. Her controlled narrative didn't just crack, it vaporized. There was no way to spin this. There was no way to tell people I was a confused, incapable girl when the building itself was wearing my name like a medal of honor. Douglas reacted with the instinct of a cornered animal. He stepped forward, his hand shooting out to grip my upper arm. His fingers dug into my bicep, painful and tight. Not here, he hissed, his voice a low vibration of fury. We are going to the green room, now. We will discuss this in private. He tried to pull me, a year ago. I would have followed. I would have let him drag me into the shadows to berate me, but I planted my feet. I stood on the floor I had reinforced. I pulled my arm back with a sharp, violent jerk that broke his grip. No, I said. Douglas blinked, shocked by the resistance. Excuse me? I said no, I repeated, my voice steady and cold. You spent 3 weeks telling everyone in this room lies about me. You did it loudly. You did it publicly. So we are going to finish this right here. I looked him in the eye. You don't get privacy for public lies. Dad? The guests nearby gasped. It was a violation of the ultimate social code. We were airing the laundry, and it was stained. Doctor. Elise Marlowe chose that moment to twist the knife. She didn't do it with malice. She did it with professional opportunism. She stepped up to the small podium that had been set up for the speeches, tapping the microphone. "If I could have everyone's attention," Elise said. The room turned to her. "In light of the incredible work unveiled tonight, the Heritage Renewal Council has a special announcement. We are launching a new $5 million grant for the preservation of historic theaters downtown, and I am thrilled to announce that the project lead for this initiative will be the woman who saved Waverly Hall." She pointed a hand toward me. "Harper Watson." The applause started slowly, rippling out from the people who had read the article, then swelling as the rest of the room joined in. It was genuine applause. It was the sound of respect. It washed over me, warm and validating, and it washed over my parents like freezing rain. The shift in the room was physical. I watched as a group of donors, people who had been hanging on my mother's every word an hour ago, turned their backs on her. They began to move toward me. "Harper," a woman I recognized as the head of the Arts Commission said, reaching out to shake my hand. "I had no idea you were behind this. We need to talk about the Opera House." "Ms. Watson," a developer called out, "do you have a card?" My parents were left standing alone in a widening circle of emptiness. They were radioactive. Blair, seeing her social capital dissolving along with her parents, decided to strike. She pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with a mixture of panic and rage. She stopped in front of me, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "You planned this," she spat, her voice trembling. "You waited until the party started. You coordinated with the magazine. You timed this whole thing to humiliate us." I looked at my sister. I looked at the dress that cost more than my rent. I looked at the fear in her eyes, the fear of a person who has no identity outside of how others perceive her. "I didn't time anything, Blair," I said softly. "I didn't call the magazine. They called me. I didn't ask for the plaque. The board demanded it." I took a step closer to her. "I didn't orchestrate a takedown. I just stopped hiding. The only reason this feels like a humiliation is because you built your entire reality on the hope that I would stay invisible." Blair opened her mouth to argue, but a hand on her shoulder stopped her. It was Grant, her husband. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Blair. His face was pale, his expression one of dawning horror. "You told me she was asking for money," Grant said, his voice low but audible. "Last month, you moved $10,000 from our joint account and said Harper was in trouble and needed help with rent." Blair went white. "Grant, I can explain." "She just won a government contract," Grant said, gesturing to me. "She isn't broke, so where's the money? Blair? And the charity donation you said got lost in the mail last year? The one for the hospital wing?" "Grant, please," Blair whispered, looking around at the staring guests. "Not here." "What else have you lied about?" Grant asked. He stepped away from her, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional break. "I can't trust a single word that comes out of your mouth." While Blair's marriage was fracturing, Douglas was facing his own reckoning. He was trying to salvage a conversation with Judge Holloway, a federal judge whose endorsement was critical for Douglas's business expansion. I watched the judge close the folder he was holding. He buttoned his suit jacket, a gesture of finality. "I don't understand, Judge," Douglas was saying, his voice tight with desperation. "We had a verbal agreement. That was before I knew how you treat your own blood," Judge Holloway said. His voice was not loud, but it was made of granite. "I rely on the character, Douglas. A man who will discard his own daughter to improve his social standing will certainly sell out a partner to save a nickel." The judge looked at me, nodded respectfully, and then looked back at my father. "I prefer people who don't discard their own. The deal is dead." Douglas stood there, mouth slightly open, watching the biggest deal of his career walk out the door I had restored. My phone buzzed in my hand. I looked down. It was a text from Aunt Sarah, the same aunt who had told me to take my meds earlier that day. "I am reading the article." The text said, "I am so sorry. Harper, I didn't know. I feel like a fool. I'm so proud of you. It was a small thing, but it was proof. Once the lie breaks, people start choosing the truth. The spell my parents had cast over the family was broken. I looked at Marianne and Douglas one last time. They looked smaller now. The grandeur of the hall swallowed them up. They were just two people in fancy clothes who had gambled everything on appearances and lost. "If you want a daughter," I said to them, my voice calm, devoid of the need for their approval, "if you ever want to see me again, you will learn to talk to me like a human being." I paused, letting the words land. Not a liability, not a prop, not a secret. Until you can do that, do not contact me. I turned my back on them. I turned toward the room full of people who were waiting to meet the architect. For the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away from my family. I was walking toward myself. I did not wait for the applause to die down. I did not wait for the inevitable, desperate attempts at damage control from my mother. Nor did I wait for my father to try and reframe the evening as a misunderstanding. I turned around and walked back toward the entrance. Passing through the crowd felt different this time. When I had walked in, the air had been thick with judgment and curiosity. Now, as I walked out, it was parted by something else entirely: respect. People stepped aside, not because I was contagious, but because I was significant. I reached the grand walnut doors, the ones I had spent hundreds of hours sanding until my fingerprints were practically embedded in the grain. I pushed them open. The cool night air hit my face, smelling of rain and asphalt, and it felt like the first breath I had taken in 34 years. I handed the valet my ticket. He brought my dusty SUV around, parking it right next to a gleaming Rolls-Royce. I got in, tossed my clutch on the passenger seat, and drove away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what I was leaving behind. In the weeks that followed, the fallout in Old Crestline was slow, quiet, and absolutely devastating. High society is an ecosystem built on trust and perception. My mother had violated both. It wasn't just that she had lied about me, it was that she had implicated her friends in the lie. She had asked them to pity a woman who was actually a rising star. She had made them look foolish for believing her sympathy narrative. The invitations stopped coming. The charity luncheons suddenly had full guest lists when Marianne tried to RSVP. She wasn't dramatically exiled. That would have been too loud. She was simply ghosted. The community treated her exactly the way she had treated me. They cropped her out of the picture. Her narrative of the saintly mother dealing with a broken child became a stain on her reputation that no amount of gala hosting could wash away. My father took a different route. Douglas respected one thing above all else: leverage. And for the first time, I had it. 4 months after the gala, I received a text message from him. It didn't start with "I'm sorry." It didn't ask for forgiveness. That would have required emotional vulnerability, a language Douglas did not speak. Saw the feature on the library project in the Architectural Digest. The text read, "Impressive structural work. I would like to come see the site sometime." It was an olive branch wrapped in professional validation. He wanted to be close to success. He wanted to be able to tell his friends that he was consulting on his daughter's next masterpiece. He wanted to rewrite history again, to pretend he had been there all along. I looked at the phone for a long time. A younger version of me would have jumped at the chance. I would have cleaned the site, put on my best clothes, and begged for his approval. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I didn't need him to tell me I was good. The buildings told me that. The awards told me that. The mirror told me that. I typed back a single sentence. "When it is finished, I will let you know." I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I set a boundary. I controlled the access. I pressed send and put the phone away, returning to my blueprints. Blair did not fare as well. Her marriage to Grant, which had always looked like a magazine cover, began to show the hairline fractures of a foundation built on sand. Grant was a man obsessed with image. Yes, but he also prided himself on being real, watching his wife lie so effortlessly, seeing her mirror her parents' cruelty, had flipped a switch in his brain. He started looking at their life, the finances, the social climbing. The stories she told about her friends. With a forensic eye, he realized she was curating their reality the same way Marianne had curated the family photos. They were still married, but the warmth was gone. Blair was now living in the same cold, performative silence she had once helped enforce on me. As for me, I kept building. Dr. Elise Marlowe continued to be my mentor, but the dynamic had shifted. I wasn't just her protégé anymore. I was her peer. At the annual Heritage Council dinner, she introduced me not by my accolades, but by my character. There are architects who build for ego, she told the room, and there are architects who build for truth. Harper Watson refused to let a building lie, even when it would have been easier, even when it cost her personally. That is the kind of backbone you cannot teach. I took that energy into my new flagship project. It was a massive undertaking, restoring the old City Opera House, a crumbling giant that had been slated for demolition. It was bigger, harder, and higher profile than Waverly Hall, every day. I climbed the scaffolding, smelled the dust, and felt the weight of the stone. I wasn't working to prove them wrong anymore. I was working because this was who I was. I realized something profound as I stood on the roof of the Opera House. Looking out over the city skyline, I hadn't won by humiliating my parents. If I had walked into that gala just to scream at them, I would have still been playing their game. I would have still been the reactive, emotional daughter. I won by refusing the role they assigned me. They wanted me to be the victim. I chose to be an architect. They wanted me to be invisible. I chose to be undeniable. And the final twist? The one that makes me shake my head and laugh when I'm alone in my studio? I found out later from Arthur Penhaligon, the board member, that the plaque had been commissioned 6 months before the gala. The decision to honor the lead architect was standard procedure for the grant. The plaque had been sitting in a storage room, wrapped in plastic, with my name on it for half a year. My parents could have known, if they had asked a single question about my work. If they had shown a single ounce of interest in my life, they would have known it was coming. They could have been prepared. They could have shared in the moment. But they were so committed to their version of the story, the version where I was nothing, that they blinded themselves to reality. The truth was always coming for them. They simply chose to be the last people in the world to know. So, if you are out there right now, feeling like you are being erased, listen to me. If you are the person they crop out of the photos, if you are the one they talk over at dinner, if you are building in silence, keep building. Do not let them take your tools. Do not let them convince you that you are broken just because you don't fit their frame. One day, the room that tried to erase you will ask where you are. They will need you. And in that moment, you will finally decide whether to walk in or whether to leave them standing in the dark, wondering how they missed the light. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please comment down below with your city and country so we can see how far this story has traveled. If you enjoyed this journey and want to hear more stories about people taking back their power, please subscribe to the channel Monica Revenge Stories. Hit that like button and smash the hype button to help this video get discovered by more people who might need to hear it. Stay strong and keep building.